All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Leslie Loudon. I'm the Deputy Director of the Division of Financial Assistance with the State Water Resources Control Board, and I want to welcome all of you to the workshop on our proposed amendments to the policy for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. And I want to thank you all, especially those of you here in person. It's nice to be able to talk to some faces. I know we have quite a few people on the web listening in too, and we'll be able to get their comments via email, but it is nice to have some personal interaction here, so I want to thank you. I also want to thank you all for, this has been about a 1.5-year process that we've undertaken to try to come up with what we wanted to propose as far as the policy amendments. We held a number of workshops earlier to get input from all the stakeholders because, this is a big change to the program, and we want to make sure, we've got a wonderful program, so we want to make sure anything we change, we don't lose those great components of the program. We don't want to, inadvertently make it not work for people. So it's really important to give us your input on it, how it's going to work for you, how you see these changes, and, suggestions. It's open for comment right now. We really want your input, and that's part of the reason we're having these workshops. So I just wanted to give that brief introduction, and thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Christopher here, who's going to run through the presentation. Feel free to interrupt us, ask questions. Like I say, this is a pretty big change, so we want to make sure people understand what it is we're trying to do and how it will affect you. So thank you again.
Well, again, just to add on to Leslie, thanks everybody for coming out, and for those on the web, thank you for joining us this morning. We have a fairly small crowd, so maybe we could do some quick introductions. I'll introduce the staff here. We have Elizabeth Brown, Elnaz Nasai, Bob Pontareri, James Maughan, who's the Assistant Deputy Director. We have Nicole Morgan in the back. She's one of the other supervising engineers in Division of Financial Assistance, with an up-and-coming future Clean Water SRF manager, probably. Yes. And then Lance Reese, who's over our administrative section for both the Clean Water and Drinking Water SRF programs. And so maybe we could just do a quick set of introductions for the audience here. Go ahead.
Bill Pearley, TCSD.
Nicole Cook, Coleman Engineering.
Ryan Huffam, Climatech.
Ida Sultani, Region 5, NPDS and Compliance Enforcement.
Terry Barquez, City of Newman.
Catherine Reyes, City of Newman.
Lou Humphreys, City of Newman.
Jeff Bench, California Rural Water Association.
Adam Link with the California Association of Sanitation Agencies.
Nan Bailey with Regional SAN.
Jennifer Clary, Clean Water Action.
Well, again, thanks everybody for coming. So I've got maybe a dozen slides here, so it's not a huge presentation. So at any time, stop me for questions. And for those of you on the web, you can send in questions by email to cleanwatersrf, as one word, at waterboards.ca.gov. And so we'll have plenty of time for questions and questions after the presentation as well. So stop me at any time if you have any questions. So just a quick background here. I assume that most of you are generally familiar with the Clean Water SRF program, and we also have other sources of funds that we work that we combine with Clean Water SRF loan funds, other complementary sources of financing, state bond funds for the most part. So the policy covers both the Clean Water SRF program as well as those complementary financing programs. We try to run those things in conjunction with each other so that from your standpoint, you're just submitting one application. We'll figure out on the back end what sources of funds wind up giving you the best financing package. The program has been pretty dynamic since basically 1989, almost coming up on 30 years since our first loan in 1989. It's been a pretty dynamic program. On average, we've amended the policy about every 2 or 3 years. Last time was in February of 2015. So we're a little overdue probably for a policy amendment. And then, as you probably know or have gotten wind of, just a huge demand over the last several years, demand has really exploded on the Clean Water SRF. Currently, we have in-house in excess of $8 billion in applications. And a pretty good chunk of those, probably nearly half of those, are complete applications. So meaning that people have submitted all the documents and all the pieces of paper that we need in order to decide whether to give funding to a project. And of course, we don't have anywhere near that amount of money. So that's kind of one of the big drivers here, is to try to prioritize these applications. We ostensibly have a prioritization system in the existing policy, but it never really came into effect. And so as it turns out, it's not really very good. We need a better way to prioritize those applications. We live in a finite world, and as I say, we don't have $8 billion. So as with most things, we have to somehow prioritize and decide which things we're going to focus on and which things we can conceivably do. And try to do that in a way that maintains stable finances for the Clean Water SRF program. I mean, we don't want to, we have over the last several years started to sell bonds based on the equity in the fund, but we don't want to take on too much debt. And so we want to try to do that in a responsible way. And one of the other issues, that's the main issue that I'm going to be talking about today. There are other changes in the policy. Probably the other fairly significant thing is to try to create some additional flexibility to deal with borrower credits. Of course, we deal with the largest wastewater agencies in the state as well as the smallest wastewater agencies in the state. And so large agencies typically have their own debt. They've gone out into the municipal bond market and sold their own bonds. And if you know anything about the municipal bond market, basically you get to decide how you define various terms, revenue or additional debt coverage or a lot of other things. And so we have to try to deal with all of those different variations and subtleties. And so one of the things that we're trying to do in this policy amendment is create some additional flexibility for the Deputy Director of DFA to be able to accept those terms rather than try to fit everybody into a single box. And so that's created some difficulties over the last several years dealing with some of the larger agencies in the state. And then, of course, you're aware that we also manage the drinking water SRF program. So in an ongoing effort to try to keep those programs as consistent as possible. Each program has its own idiosyncrasies, of course, its own different rules. Primarily, they're largely the same program, but we want to try to make those programs as consistent as possible with each other. And then, as I say, on average, we've probably amended the policy every 2 or 3 years. If you work with any sort of system or process for long enough, you find things that don't quite fit into the round hole. And so there are some additional things in here where we're trying to add clarity, flexibility into the policy to deal with situations that just come up in life. And so that's one of the other things that I'll talk about today. So as I say, the big thing is coming up with a new priority system. So this went into effect somewhat with this year's intended use plan. Each year we do a business plan for the Clean Water SRF that was approved by the board in June. And so one of the big changes in the IUP, the intended use plan for this year, was what we called a fundable list. And so you have to be on the fundable list in order to get funding during this year. In the past, we accepted applications continuously and we financed projects continuously, and there was a certain horse race aspect to the process of getting financing. That had certain benefits for us, but certain downsides for applicants. Particularly knowing, when am I going to get financed? Am I going to get financed? Those sorts of questions are, of course, very important to you as an applicant because you're trying to line up the financing and line up the construction and a lot of other things that you're trying to nail down. So this policy amendment would formalize that process of how do we get to a fundable list. This year we did it somewhat qualitatively based on a number of factors that we thought were helpful, but this is going to formalize that system. And so I'm going to describe in the next 6 or 7 slides how that process is going to work. Now, the first thing before we talk about that process of scoring applications and putting, compiling them into a list and then coming up with where the cutoff will be for that list. So small disadvantaged communities, small severely disadvantaged communities, and public health projects are automatically going to be fundable. So this is only going to apply to folks that aren't severely disadvantaged or aren't disadvantaged communities. Severely disadvantaged communities and disadvantaged communities. Yes, absolutely. So the definition of those communities is they're small, number one. So they're 20,000 population or less. Disadvantaged community means the community's median household income is 80% or less of the statewide median household income. Severely disadvantaged is 60% or less of the statewide median household income. Yes, Nan.
Would that include like septic conversion projects or, small neighborhoods that are on septic tanks that are failing that might pose an environmental or public health or water quality degradation?
Probably, most likely. So then you touched on public health. So in the current policy, basically we've carried over the definition of what was category A, public health. There's a pretty high bar for being considered a public health type project. And that would be, I can't quote it off the top of my head, but basically there's a finding by the county health officer, and that's agreed to by the regional board. You can read that in the policy yourself. But historically, we really haven't ever had too many public health projects funded by the Clean Water SRF. I can't think of one. I couldn't say there hasn't been one, but pretty rare. But just from a logical standpoint, if there is a project that meets that description of a public health project, well, then that certainly should be a priority. If you have sewage running down the middle of the street and kids playing in it, well, obviously that should be a priority for us. So that's the starting point there is, again, small, severely disadvantaged communities, small disadvantaged communities, and public health type projects, automatically fundable. Other projects that don't fit into those categories, they're going to go through this priority scoring process. And then the other key point I want to make here, which is in the past we've tended to emphasize having a complete application. Because obviously if we don't have a complete application, then we can't provide financing to you. But we intentionally, in developing this system, decided, and we did this for the IUP this past year, we are going to look at all applications. So it isn't necessary that you have a complete application to be scored and to get on the fundable list. There are going to be some other things associated with that if you don't have a complete application at the time we do the scoring, but to get on the fundable list does not require a complete application. So let's start out talking in general about the fundable list, and then we'll get more and more specific as we go through these slides. So I mentioned sustainable finances. So this past year, another thing that was included in the IUP was a sustainable funding target. So we asked our financial advisor to update the capacity of the Clean Water SRF program to provide financing. And conservatively, we can do about $1 billion in financing per year on an ongoing basis. So the target for the fundable list is going to be, we're going to be shooting for a fundable list that's somewhere between 90% and 125% of that $1 billion figure. So the $1 billion figure is not every year we're going to do exactly $1 billion in financing. We're going to be shooting for that. So some years we might be above that, some years we might be below that. And so in coming up with this fundable list, we're going to be shooting for that range of between 90 and 125. And then the other thing that will be true for the fundable list is if you get on the fundable list and we don't execute, the goal will be to execute agreements for all the projects on the fundable list by June 30th of the fiscal year. So we run from July 1st to June 30th. So this fiscal year runs from July 1 of this year to June 30th of next year. Our objective is to execute agreements for everybody on that fundable list by the end of the fiscal year. Now, if we don't achieve that goal, you will roll over into the next year's fundable list automatically. You don't get kicked off the fundable list at the end of the fiscal year. So let's talk about the process in general. So this will look very similar to the existing process for developing the IUP, but we're going to add on this scoring component to it. So I'll just walk you through this. So it's going to start with our staff going through all the applications that are in-house at the end of this calendar year. So in January, our staff is going to go through using this scoring system that I'm going to talk about here in a few minutes. And we're in the process of developing a worksheet. And so staff will be assigned, 10 or 20 applications to look at. Okay, you go and score all these applications here and fill out this worksheet in order to figure out, well, what should the priority score be for all of these applications? And then each of those scoring sheets is going to be sent to the applicant. So the applicant will have an opportunity to take a look at that scoring sheet and say, well, I think you might have missed something here, or how does this work? I think this should get a score of such and such, whatever the case might be. Once all that process is finished, then all the scores are going to be put together and compiled, and we're going to have to analyze them and sort them from highest to lowest and put all of that into the draft IUP and combine that with the funding target. So we're trying to match this list of applications, which is going to be several hundred projects long. We had over 200 applications that we looked at as part of this year's IUP. And so we're going to have to put all those scores together and to try to match up the dollar amounts for these projects with this funding target. And all of that will then be put into the draft IUP. Of course, that draft IUP is going to be reviewed by a number of people, ultimately by Leslie, and then ultimately we will put it out for public review as we normally do with the IUP. Typically that happens in early April. There's a public review period, typically 30 days. And then we would address those comments and of course then take it to the board for their consideration and hopefully adoption. So yes, sir. Got it.
Do DAC projects go straight to level 4 or step 4? Because they're not scored.
They're not scored, so they automatically go on the fundable list.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the 30,000-foot view of the process. So a key part of that is, okay, we're going to have to score these applications. So how do we go about doing that? What's the nitty-gritty of that? So we've developed this proposal for a priority scoring system. The priority score is going to be the sum of 3 components. There's going to be a primary score, a secondary score, and a readiness score. And the maximum of those, the maximum score that you can get is 16. So primary score, that's the primary part of the score. So the Clean Water SRF program is a water quality program. We do provide financing, but that's not really our main objective. We're just trying to achieve water quality objectives by providing financing and subsidizing certain things that we hope are beneficial to water quality ultimately. So the primary score is when you look at the list of the folks that submit applications to us. When I was looking at those projects and the descriptions of the projects and thinking about them, I came up with this idea that it's kind of a combination of 2 things. Well, they were trying to achieve some purpose and they were having an effect on some sort of resource. So I came up with this idea of a matrix. And so what we would first do is take a look at, well, what is the purpose of the project? And they kind of fell into 3 different categories. Either there was an existing problem there, typically a permit violation, a history of permit violations, or they were trying to prevent some problem that they foresaw in the near future, or they're making improvements. They're going above and beyond the call of duty, so to speak. And so I came up with that idea. And then on the left-hand side, you can see the resources there that I sort of categorized projects into. There might be a drinking water source that's being affected, a watershed project, typically. Of course, the delta is a huge issue for the board. So I thought that seemed like a logical category. We do a lot of water recycling projects with the Clean Water SRF, as well as combine that with various sources of state funds. Impaired water bodies is certainly an issue. A lot of TMDLs have been developed, and so that's a big issue that has to be addressed. And of course, we have every discharger has a discharge permit, and there are a number of other plans in place, various plans that projects intersect with. So the idea here is that we would look at both the purpose and the resource affected by the project, and we would pick a score out of that table, one number out of that table. It's not a cumulative score. It's just one number, whatever the highest number is. If a project might fit into 2 of those different categories, we would give the project the highest score out of that table. So all applications would receive a primary score. Like I say, it's one number from that table. Now, if there's nothing about the project that fits into one of those categories in the table, then the primary score would be 2. So that's the first part of the priority score. Then we go obviously to the secondary part of the score. Now the secondary part of the score is not every project would necessarily receive a secondary score. Some projects might receive 0. This is, to use maybe a colloquial term, well, we might think of this as bonus points or extra credit or something like that. I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but as the name implies, it's the secondary part of the score. So again, this is one number out of the table, and we have 4 different characteristics that we could identify, and somebody could get additional points for that secondary part of the score. So the first is if folks have a climate change action plan. Obviously that's an issue that is important to the board, been so over the last several years. So if there's a climate change action plan that the applicant has adopted, or it could also be a third-party system that they might sign up for, and the climate change action plan needs to be specific to the agency and identify specific actions, not just an aspirational plan, but specific actions that the agency is going to take or that project is going to help implement. Second category would be if there's multiple water quality impairments, or eliminates or reduces multiple sources of water pollution, or eliminates the discharge altogether. There's additional points for that. If a project is cited in a regional environmental management plan, so that is something that multiple agencies in cooperation with each other have developed a management plan to deal with various environmental issues. It increases the local supply of drinking water, or has multimedia environmental benefits. That's also worth extra points there. And then last category is if the applicant provides funds to match the federal grants. As you hopefully are aware, we do get money from the federal government, and then for every $5 that the federal government gives us, the state has to contribute $1. So there's a way for the applicant to do that and help the state meet that matching requirement. So if you agree to do that, that could also get you 2 points. So last but certainly not least is readiness. So as I sort of alluded to later, if we don't have a complete application, well, there's no, there isn't much I know in life, but that's one of the things I do know for certain. Incomplete application, I can't execute an agreement. That's That's just the cold, hard reality of it. So readiness is certainly important. I mean, it could be the greatest project in the world, but if it's just an idea on the drawing board, you know, there are other things that are ready to go. So we want to focus on things that are ready to go. And so there's two aspects of this. This would be a combination of these two parts of the scores. It's not like the primary and secondary score where we just pick one number. Here we're going to combine the two scores here. Both, the first part of the score deals with the application that's submitted to DFA for the financing agreement, all the papers that you submit to us. And the second part is how far along are you in plans and specifications. So we would add those two parts together. If you have submitted a complete application as of December 31st, the cutoff date, then you get 2 points as part of the priority score. If your plans and specifications are more than 49% complete at that December 31st cutoff date, then you get 1 additional point. If they're more than 89%, then you get 2 points. Now, if you don't meet either of those thresholds, then the readiness score is 0. Okay, so I just wanted to run through an example of this. Hopefully that was clear, but just in an effort to be absolutely clear. So here's an example of how we might develop a priority score. So as I say, first we would look at, well, what's the purpose of the project? What is the resource being affected by the project? So let's say we have a critical improvements at a wastewater treatment plant project. That's the description of the project. So if by looking at that, we looked at that example and it looked to us like there wasn't any permit violations necessarily, but they're trying to make sure that they don't have permit violations in the future. So it looks like a preventative project. So it looks like they're trying to prevent future water quality permit violations. So if we go back to the primary table here, that's preventative water quality plan permit. We'll look at that cell in that table. And so primary score would be 6. Looked at the secondary score, verify which secondary characteristic best describes the project. So the applicant has developed a detailed climate change action plan. That project will help them implement that plan. So there's 3 points for the secondary score. And then the readiness score, so they had 100% application submitted as of December 31st. Plans and specifications were 100% complete. They would get a readiness score of 4. You add those together, if my math is correct, then they would get a priority score of 13. Now, here comes the hard part, because as I say, last IUP we had over 200 applications. Many of those were small disadvantaged or severely disadvantaged communities. They were automatically on the fundable list, but I'm sure there were well over 100 applications that wound up being quote unquote scored as part of this year's IUP. So I did, as part of developing this idea here of how we would go about this fundable list, I did basically rescore this year's comprehensive list that was in the IUP to test it out, see how it would work. And it worked well enough for me to, propose it to Leslie. So that was a good step in our process there. The results were certainly different than what was in this year's IUP. I won't kid you about that, but they seem pretty good, and so we're going forward with this idea. But in thinking about that and running that test run, I spent a lot of time thinking about, well, how is this going to play out in the future? Because we have one set of projects this year, we're going to have different projects next year. We're going to have different projects 5 years from now and 10 years from now, of course. So I tried to come up with a system that was objective. It wasn't my judgment. It was the system's judgment about what this is going to produce. So each year, this is going to be, to a certain extent, an iterative process, because like I say, next year they're going to be a different set of applications, and every year it's going to be a slightly different mix of applications that are going to have to be scored. So there's going to have to be some iterative process here in developing this fundable list. So, of course, we go through, as I say, scoring all the individual applications, coming up with their priority scores, compiling those into a list, sorting those from highest to lowest. One of the keys here is that if you have a score, all the applications that have the same score are either going to be fundable or not fundable. So one of the things in my test run, I came up with a score. I had a bunch of applications that had a score of 10. Now they were less than the 90% target. When I went down to the score of 9, it jumped from $807 million to over $4 billion. So that presented a problem because I couldn't say, well, we'll fund everybody with a score of 9, because that would just not, it just doesn't add up. So we're going to have to come up with some way to have some further modifications to that list of projects. So as I say, we're trying to pick a cutoff score where everybody with the same score is either fundable or not fundable. So if the cutoff score is less than 90%, okay, we've got to go down to the next lowest score. If that's more than 125%, well, then what do we do? So that's where these additional modifications come in. Now, if it's between 90 and 125, ta-da, we're done. Well, that didn't happen in my test run, and I'm not so optimistic that I think it's going to happen in the future. So we're probably going to have to bring in these additional modifications here. So what are those? So we've proposed 2 additional modifications to make this come out to something that's between 90 and 125% of that target. Now the key here is that this is only going to apply to those above the proposed cutoff score. So like I say, in my test run, the score of 9 resulted in about, let's just for round numbers call it $9 billion worth of applications. So what we would do is we would put 2 potential modifications onto that list of projects. Number 1, we would add points for large disadvantaged communities and large severely disadvantaged communities. So large, just the mirror image of small, those communities that are over 20,000. So if the community is over 20,000 and the median household income is 80% or less of the statewide, okay, that's a large disadvantaged community. You would add 2 points to that application. If it's severely disadvantaged, 60% or less of the median household income, we would add 3 points. And then we would try that process again of finding a cutoff score that results in a list between 90 and 125%. Yes, Jennifer.
So you're putting projects on the list whether or not they're ready, and part of, but not all of their points are based on their shovel readiness. So it seems to me that you're going to end up with a lot of projects on your list that may not be ready to go to construction in your fiscal year. So have you looked at that, or?
Yes, and I may have neglected to put that into the presentation, but yes, if that's true, if they're not ready to go with plans and specs and go out to bid and go to construction, there will be a secondary deadline there for submitting either a complete application or complete plans and specifications to remain on the fundable list.
At that point, do you go back if that drops you either below 90% or somewhere in that range and add new projects that might have otherwise qualified?
No. So if they drop off the list, then we're not going to add projects to replace them. No. Okay, so let's say we go through this exercise of adding points to reflect community economic status. That still doesn't get us between 90 and 125%. So the last ditch thing here we're going to do is we would provide partial funding to some applications. We would attempt to provide 100% financing to the greatest extent possible, but some projects we may have to identify partial funding, but we would only do that in a way that's uniform to the applicants. We're not going to say, well, somebody gets 10% and somebody else gets 50% of their project. It has to be a uniform percentage across those projects. And again, driven by that, trying to meet that target of 125% of the sustainable financing level. So I know there's a lot of details there, and certainly if you have any questions now, but if you don't, you need to give it a little thought. Certainly plenty of time for questions and comments. Yes, Jennifer.
Just thinking about this is similar to what the drinking water SRF did when it was over at Public Health, and they had categories, public health categories, and they ended up sending funding, adding about double the dollar value to their fundable list that they actually expected to fund. So I'm just kind of offering a cautionary note, and it was probably a little more extreme there because they didn't clean out their list regularly, that when you do that, you do end up with a lot of folks at the end of the year who don't have a project ready yet. And I don't know if you've figured that out from doing your dry runs, but I'm just kind of wondering if you might think about increasing the size of your fundable list just so you can be sure to commit all your funds.
I haven't yet given up on coming up with a perfect system, but yeah, there are downsides to every system, and yeah, that's definitely one of them. Nan?
I was just thinking about the scenario, thank you, of like a septic tank conversion project and getting the application complete, or maybe not even complete, but just what would be like the minimum that the project would have to meet to get on the list? Like a score of 8 or 9 or 10 to get on the list for that year's?
Well, I think first of all, again, I would repeat that
Yeah.
if it's a disadvantaged community or public health, it's automatically fundable. So we don't really have to worry about any minimums.
Oh, okay.
Now let's just take the general case of any project. What's the minimum score to get on? I don't know at this point.
Yeah.
I think we're going to have to deal with this process for a couple of years, and we're going to have to develop a track record of, okay, here's what the fundable score, cutoff score was last year, and then, so that'll hopefully give folks an idea and allow them to do some self-scoring and say, well, this one's probably not a really good contender for the fundable list for the Clean Water SRF program, but these are, and that's what my hope is. One of the benefits of taking this approach is that you as the applicants will be able to do some self-scoring and focus more on those things that are likely to have success getting on the fundable list.
Okay. I know with the Prop 1 funding, there was a pot of money for septic conversions. And in the future, if there are other bond funds available for those types of projects, would they have to already be on this list? Or I guess at that point, we would just get our projects on with whatever new bond funding is available, right?
So I thought about that.
Yeah.
And so what you'll see in the draft policy is that towards the end of this section that talks about this fundable list, developing this fundable list, it says, because projects that are being scored may be eligible for Clean Water SRF and other funds. And so we do want to find enough projects to be able to commit other funds that may not be getting Clean Water SRF loan funds. Maybe they're just grant funds all by themselves. So there's a paragraph in there that says, once we go through all this process, if we still have, if it looks like we don't have enough projects to take all the state grant funds, we can still add additional projects that are just requesting state grant funds to that list.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, because like I say, the driver here is the amount of money that's being requested for the loan program. That's what's driving this thing, and so that's what we have to try to manage and limit. But yeah, we can add additional projects on there that don't have an impact on the loan funds. So that's the priority scoring process and the fundable list. As I touched on in the introduction, one of the things that we're trying to do is give some additional flexibility in the credit review area. So we added some language to say that the deputy director has some discretion to look at.
Before we go on to this, maybe we can take the questions about the scoring.
Sure. Yeah, do we? Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, just go ahead and read it out.
She needs the mic.
Sure.
Tom Shale from High Desert Water District. What was meant by the comment that the federal government gives $5 and the state gives $1? So
So the question was, explain the matching requirement. The federal government gives us $5. The state has to put in $1. Not quite understanding that. So the Clean Water SRF program was first authorized by Congress in 1987, and it's primarily been over that period since that period of time a loan program. Over the last about 10 years or so, 8 or 10 years, we have been allowed to give some loan forgiveness. A certain amount of those grants that we get from the federal government can be loan forgiveness, but primarily it's been a loan program. So it operates similar to the way a bank operates. So somebody puts money into a bank, and then the bank loans that money out, and they earn interest, and then they loan it out, it gets prepaid, and they loan it out to other people. So basically, the Clean Water SRF program is a bank to a certain extent. So the capital comes from the federal government and the state of California. And there's, of course, SRF programs in all 50 states. And there are drinking water SRF programs in all 50 states. They all basically operate fundamentally that same way. So every year we submit an application to US EPA for a capitalization grant. So that's the capital for the program. So for every $5 that Uncle Sam gives us, the state has to contribute $1 to match that. So that's the 5-to-1 matching ratio.
Christopher, what happens if we don't match it?
We can't draw the funds from EPA. And we have to show them the match before we draw the dollar from that, from the federal treasury. Okay, another question.
yeah, Elaine Bergausen from Eco Consultant. Will planning grants for clean water SRF projects also be scored using this system? If yes, how will readiness be scored?
So the question is, will planning loans, I think it was meant loans, if they're planning grants, most planning grants are for disadvantaged communities and severely disadvantaged communities, so they will automatically be on the fundable list. Others that don't fit into that category of disadvantaged or severely disadvantaged, then the answer to the question is yes, they have to be on the fundable list, and they will be scored exactly the same way as any other project. So they're going to get basically 0 for plans and specifications readiness.
Brad Lower, when you are doing the scoring and you are over 125%, why not use the percentage of match the local can provide? If we only need to finance 50%, then we might get in where someone else who needs to finance 85%, wouldn't we?
Well, that's an intriguing idea. I don't have an immediate answer to that question.
So we'll get back to him.
I'm going to think about that one. Okay, another question?
You mentioned in your presentation that there may be some projects that may appropriate for a state grant instead of a SRF loan. Is this a separate application process, or is it decided by your staff? The project we have in mind is a purchase and installation of water meters. The community is disadvantaged by economics, but on the cost by population.
So there's one application for clean water type projects. So that is Clean Water SRF program related, as well as any of the complementary programs. So right now we have Proposition 1 funds, grant funds for disadvantaged communities. So yeah, there's just one application form. There aren't separate application forms by program or funding source. Okay. All right, so just have one quick slide regarding the credit review. As I say, trying to give us some additional flexibility to deal with a variety of situations, dealing with a variety of borrowers that can come up with their own definitions for various terms that are important from a loan perspective. Like I say, what's the definition of revenue? What's the definition of expenses? What does an additional debt test look like? So on and so forth. So this would allow us to take a look at the borrower's definitions and make a risk assessment. Are those definitions okay? Are we okay with those definitions? And therefore we would just accept them rather than trying to negotiate, well, something that works for both of us. We would just accept the borrower's definitions. And then we are proposing to increase the coverage ratio slightly. So senior and parity debt, we would look for at least a 1.2 times coverage on that, but also lowering the debt coverage on the subordinate debt that the borrower might have to just 1 times coverage. So as I say, that's the main story here today. The main story is the new priority scoring system and the fundable list and how that all works. Second kind of big supporting player here is the credit review. And then there's some other minor players here that I'll touch on very quickly here. Eligible start date, we did make this change in this year's intended use plan. Historically, if you've dealt with the Clean Water SRF program, you'll know that the construction costs were only eligible after basically we had done all the application review at the tail end of the process. And of course, there are some folks that can go out to construction. They're comfortable that they will wind up with an executed agreement. They have enough cash on hand to be able to go and start construction. But in the past, they've lost eligibility until we could basically execute the agreement. So we relaxed that requirement in this year's IUP to say that we could go back to basically the start of construction to the notice to proceed date and preserve that eligibility for those construction costs. There's still some risk associated with that, of course. If for some reason we couldn't execute an agreement, then you would have to come up with your own financing, but pretty rare that happens. Most people submit applications that are eligible for the program. So now we've permanently put that into the policy that eligibility for construction costs can go back to the start of construction. We're made some modifications to the planning and design loan section. The way we had structured it was not working very well, and they were doing it somewhat differently on the drinking water side, and that works better. So we've adopted what the drinking water SRF folks have used. And I say used, we've only had a couple of instances where this has been done. But basically, if there is a planning and design loan, we won't refinance the loan per se, but we will change the terms of the planning and design loan to match the construction loan if we ultimately give a construction loan. And as the question indicated earlier, in order to be approved for a planning and design loan, the application has to be on the fundable list. We're making some changes to the water conservation and management section of the policy. The board has historically had its own policy going back many, many years, which predates a lot of changes that have since been made in state law. So we decided to realign those requirements to match up with state law. We thought it was probably redundant for the board to have its own policy regarding that. We're dropping the pledged revenues and fund resolution. That's been kind of a problematic thing over the years. And instead, we will look for a closing resolution. Agencies have to, if you look at that government code section 5852, it's kind of a truth in borrowing. That's my layman's explanation of that particular section of the government code. The agency is supposed to let the public know, how much they're borrowing, what are the terms, so on and so forth. So we will look for a resolution at the end of the process covering those things.
What percentage of projects currently receiving Clean Water SRF funds are private sector applicants?
Basically 0. But there are several categories of eligibility in the Clean Water SRF program that they don't specify a type of applicant. So it could be a public applicant as well as a private applicant. We dropped the appraisal requirement if you're purchasing land with the loan, but we would still require an appraisal if you're using land as part of the security. We won't accept just land as the only security, but if you're doing that in conjunction with another source of repayment, we would still look for an appraisal there. But if you're just purchasing land for the treatment plant or an easement or something like that, we're dropped the appraisal requirement for that. As I alluded to here, there's a number of different eligibilities for the Clean Water SRF program. There's a list of actually 11 of them. Historically, there were 3. We had publicly owned treatment works. We had projects, non-point source projects that met the non-point source plan. And we had projects that met one of the estuary plans. There's 3 of those in California. Those 2 categories 2 and 3. We called those expanded use projects. Well, now we've expanded to 11 different eligibilities, so we're dropping the term expanded use, and you'll see quite a bit of language in there just generalizing the policy to any type of project, regardless of what eligibility it fits under. We had some remnants of, there actually used to be a policy that dealt with those expanded use categories. About 5 or 8 years ago, we put that policy into the Clean Water SRF policy. Now we're further generalizing the policy that covers every type of project that can submit an application and be financed. And then last year, the board approved a debt management policy for both SRF programs. And part of that was that prepayments now require the consent of the water board. So that's being put into the policy, reflected in the policy as well. So just about finished here. So just my thoughts on what are the benefits of this. Of course, better manage the demand on the program. Hopefully that's the objective here, while maintaining strong finances. And as I touched on a little bit earlier with Nan, so hopefully once we put this into place, you as an applicant will be able to go through and score your own applications. And hopefully over time we'll develop a track record of, somebody with a priority score of 2 is probably not going to be fundable. Somebody with a priority score of 8 or 9 or 10, or I don't know where that's going to fall out eventually. But hopefully over time we'll get some history on that, and then that will give you a better clue as to, does it make sense to submit an application for this project. Credit reviews, again, hopefully providing some more clarity and transparency, and improve the consistency between the programs. Those are the pros there. Cons, well, it's a new scoring system. Of course, anything new is going to require adjustment, not only by us, but by you as applicants, it may produce unpredictable results. I can't guarantee. I think it's a good idea, but I can't guarantee that, and so we may need to make some adjustments or improvements in the future to make that work. So, and then last slide here. Let me just kind of run through the schedule here. So the policy was posted last Friday, September 14th. It's September 18th. We're here at the workshop. We'll have a workshop on Friday down in Oakland at the East Bay Mud headquarters. We'll have one the following Tuesday at Irvine Ranch Water District. The comment period ends at noon on October 5th. And then, of course, the board meeting is November 6th. And we hope that gets approved by the board, of course. And then scoring. So as I say, the scoring for next year's IUP, which is state fiscal year 1920, July 1, 2019 to June 30th, 2020. So the scoring is going to be based on the applications as of December 31st of this calendar year. So we'll do the scoring in January. And then, as I indicated earlier, draft IUP, we hope to have that out on the street in April of next year. And then ultimately adoption of the next year's IUP in June of next year. And then, of course, working through the year to implement that. So that's all the slides I have. And like I say, we have not even 11, so less than an hour. We got plenty of time for questions.
One of my concerns is this small community grant funding charge, and you've made the decision to include it in the annual IUP rather than in the policy document. And I'm not really sure why that should be, because I think that given the small amount of grant funding that you have available, that you would want to take advantage of this on a regular basis. So I'd like you to consider including that charge in your policy document and applying it as a matter of course to all of your loans. And I'm wondering what would prevent you from doing that.
To be honest, I'm not sure what you're asking, so I apologize. Can you say it again?
So I had this little confusion with the IUP this year around the small community grant charge, because you said you hadn't been applying it, and now we're planning to apply it. Then I heard that you had been applying it. So my suggestion is, rather than putting it in the annual, the small community grant charge, the in lieu charge. So, sorry. I was just using the term that you use in the report. So my question is there any reason why you can't include it in the policy document so that it is just applied as a matter of course? What would prevent you from doing that?
So I'm going to get Lance up here because he's going to help me with this. But my understanding, the reason we haven't done that yet is we have had funds available for small disadvantage clean water type projects. What we needed to do is to get, well, that's more the drinking water fee. Go ahead.
Well, what I would say is that we modulate that fee. So rather than just collecting it on every single loan, just as a matter of course and building up a stockpile of cash, if we see a Prop 1 or you know, Prop 68 comes about and it's got cash that serves that same purpose, then we would much rather utilize that cash that needs to be taken advantage of now. And then as we see that prop money run out, we turn the spigot back on to start collecting it on loans again, just so that we can maintain an amount of cash within that particular fund that we see being utilized on a regular basis.
So this is one of the reasons why it would be helpful to have some kind of list so I understand what projects are in the pipeline. But my understanding is at one point you had a list of potential small community wastewater projects that was about $2 billion. This was several years ago. You had it on your website, and it's missing now. So none of us really know what the universe of projects is out there. But the $10 million that you'd be collecting on this in lieu charge seems to be fairly small compared to the need. So it's not really clear to me that you need that kind of fluctuation or balancing of the fund.
Excuse me, Nicole Morgan. We do have a list of projects. I don't know approximately how much it comes out to be right now, but I did do an analysis to see where we are with what funds we have remaining in Prop 1, and then the Prop 68, and then also what we do have currently in for principal forgiveness for small community grants. And right now, for this fiscal year and next fiscal year, we are able to meet the need.
I'm glad. Is that list online somewhere?
I don't believe it's online, but we can go ahead and make it available.
And do we have a list of projects that are out of compliance that we're trying to get up to shovel ready? I'm just thinking because we had no clean water grants available for several years, so it's hard for me to believe that there isn't a pent up demand.
And so we have those that have applied to us. We do talk and meet with the regional boards regularly. And so if there are additional ones out there, we may not know of every project that's out there, but we do have a list. And based on the list that we do have in house, we're able to meet the current demand. And then looking at potential additional propositions and state funds, currently the funds that are available for small disadvantaged communities for clean water funds, we're okay. And that is something that we do regularly monitor as new projects and applications come in, so that we, if there is something that where if the demand increases suddenly, we can bring it to management and to Lance's attention and let them know. So we are constantly monitoring it. Yeah, and of course. And so, yes, we do have the application status report, which I can't remember why we sent that to you, because we can send that to you, but we can also send the list. It is something that we do compile regularly in-house and take a look and monitor.
We definitely want to be able to get people the information they want. So, we know where stuff is. We know, we've got this application status report. It's everything that's come into us and how complete their application is, and that's updated regularly on our website. In the IUP, we put our comprehensive list in there, but if people are not getting information and having a hard time finding it, we want to figure out what type of report you need and how to get it to you. So we can work with you, Jennifer, to make sure we're getting it, because that's really important for us to make sure people can find the information they need on our website, and that if we're not providing it, we can try to figure out the correct type of report to help you out. But we do want to, we are trying to manage the funds so that we don't end up in a situation like drinking water was, where we had a large amount of money that we weren't using. And so we do try to manage that with the principal forgiveness. We're looking at that in the IUP, that we will use that for small disadvantaged communities if we get to the point that we don't have state bond funds and grant funds and things like that available. But we don't want to end up with a large sum of money that's not being utilized. So we do try to do that each year, of look at what is available and how we can make sure that it is being used. And if we, right, $10 million a year, but for a long time, we weren't getting that money out to small disadvantaged communities. When we got a large influx of bond money and technical assistance and planning funds, that really helped spur a lot of the projects on. So we've seen a huge increase. Our bond funds used to be like maybe $30 million in a bond. We got $250 million in Prop 1. So, and if you look at Prop 3, it's really large too. So, we're looking at an order of magnitude difference also in the bond funds. And, these projects do take a while to develop and get ready. And, and we are seeing them come in a lot more. And so we're definitely looking at that, whether we need to use that 10 million. So we'll definitely keep that in mind.
So we're getting a lot of emails requesting the PowerPoint presentation. I have sent them to all the email requests, but we will have it available on our website
Yes, just like the workshops that we did last year and then the IEP workshops we did this year. We're recording this presentation, and so we'll have the PowerPoint as well as the recording up as soon as we can get them up there.
One more question from Ari Newman. There's two questions actually. One, how would you compare a DAC, disadvantaged community, that qualifies for the list automatically versus a non-disadvantaged community scored project? And how would you determine which would get funding, assuming both are eligible?
So how would I compare a disadvantaged community that's automatically fundable with one that goes through the scoring process? So first and foremost, disadvantaged communities go on the fundable list. So if they need loan funds, they're going to get loan funds. Most of those projects get grant funds. Some of them may get a portion of the financing from loan funds. So the impact of the loan funds is generally relatively small. And we're talking maybe a few tens of millions of dollars. So really they're two separate questions. I'm not comparing a disadvantaged community with a non-disadvantaged community. I'm putting all the disadvantaged communities on the fundable list from the get-go. They're fundable, period. End of sentence. Next sentence. Other projects go through the scoring process. So they're only competing with those other projects that are going through the scoring process. They're not competing with disadvantaged communities.
Will you please elaborate on the eligibility of non-point source projects? What kind of projects would be eligible? Would it include septic systems or decentralized wastewater management?
Those are both categories, and not necessarily, there is a separate category dealing with decentralized systems now. It was added a few years ago. But just to answer the first part of the question, so how would I elaborate on non-point source projects? So the state of California, the State Water Board, has developed a non-point source implementation plan. And I don't know when the last time they've updated it. I think they're maybe in the process of updating it. But that plan is a whole plan. You know, I don't know all the details of that. But there's 6 or 7 different categories of non-point source type projects. Maybe they're changing that, I don't know. But anything that's described, any project that is going to help implement that plan, the state's non-point source plan, any project is eligible, period, end of sentence. Okay, other questions here? What do you think?
Too well, Christopher. See, no one has questions.
Is that a good sign or a bad sign?
I'll ask
Yes,
one.
sir.
You had your modifiers, and it seems like from our discussion, readiness would also be a modifier. And then I was wondering if dollar value would be a modifier. And I see a couple things there that lower cost projects might be more bang for the buck, while higher cost projects could eat up a lot of available funds.
So the system and the steps of going through that system, every project gets a readiness score. Every project gets a primary score. Projects may get a secondary score. Then that produces some result. And I'm trying to make this an objective system here so that it doesn't, because that's a very difficult question to answer, bang for buck. It's very difficult to compare on that basis. And so then the other steps are, the community economic status, and then last but not least, modifying the amounts requested for some applicants to try to fit it into that category.
I think there we're on the same page where you're modifying the amount requested. What I'm saying is all the projects that have, say, a score of 9, and then you did readiness, you did your other things, and now you got another subgroup that has a score that's about to be 10 and become eligible just for talking purposes. You still have to trim that somehow. And it seems like dollar value of the project would be something you'd want to consider.
Yes, and that as a last measure onto that, really large projects, we may have to say, well, we can only afford to provide, some percentage. In this year's IUP, there were 3 projects that were identified, each for 20% financing of what was requested. And that was to try to fit into a more sustainable financing target. Because like I say, we don't have $4 billion.
I was just going to follow. Then the other extreme would be someone who has a score of 16 and it's a $500 million project, $500 million project. I don't know if you guys run into that or have thought of that, but that seems, one project eating up half your statewide budget might be something else you need to consider.
And so I can't say that that's impossible. My experience with the program and looking at the dry run that we did for scoring is probably not going to be the case. But yeah, like I say, it's not a perfect, I'm not saying it's a perfect system, and there could be unforeseen things that happen there. And we'll just have to see how it works out.
So I was wondering if you'd considered putting TMF analysis in the policy document so that we have some consistent understanding of those requirements, because I'm hearing from folks that different regional offices apply that differently, and I'm just wondering if you guys have that. Is it all done centrally for the Clean Water Fund, or is it done at the regional boards?
TMF is explicitly a requirement in the drinking water program. There's no TMF explicit requirement on the clean water side, and regional boards, to my knowledge, maybe they do something analogous to that. Certainly our application review process is analogous to a TMF assessment, but there's nothing explicit that we do on the clean water side. Yeah.
Tom Shell, has there been a change in policy regarding debt forgiveness? Change to small community wastewater grant? So 2 questions.
So has there been a
any
change in policy to debt forgiveness? There is no debt forgiveness in the Clean Water SRF program. There is principal loan forgiveness. That's done at the front end. That's explicitly done as part of the project financing. So we say, here's a $10 million project. We're going to give you $2 million in principal forgiveness, meaning when you finish constructing the project, you only have to pay us back $8 million. So there's no mechanism in the federal statutes or the state statutes for us to forgive debt later on 10 years down the road or whatever. So what was the second part of the question?
The change to a small community wastewater grant.
Have there been changes to the small community wastewater grant? No.
Same.
No, not certainly. I don't. Were there any adjustments in the IUP this year? I don't think there was. Yeah, no, there's been no changes recently to the grant limits or requirements or anything for that for small disadvantaged community wastewater projects.
So one more question. Do you still have an impact criteria that puts small agencies in competition with large agencies with larger impacts?
No, I don't. I'm trying to think of what you might be thinking of. That doesn't ring a bell. I think the answer to that question is no.
There's a question, it's long, but I think it's more of a drinking water question. Can you speak on to how rural communities that are considered to be low income through the AB 1550 process score against those communities that are disadvantaged scored through Cal and Wire Screen? In the past, we have found that rural communities just cannot compete with those that are scored through the Cal Enviro screen.
We'll take that one offline.
Yeah, okay. And I don't have any more questions.
Okay, I have plenty of time. I don't want to rush anybody. I know that's a lot of information to digest and think about the implications of that and how it might play out into the future.
Does anyone have a better idea?
Well, I was going to say that, we held the 3 workshops when we started this process, and there were a lot of ideas thrown out and a lot of them, questions that we're hearing that we considered. Christopher and his staff went through lots of different iterations, test ran it through what we have in-house, their experience, things like that. And, it was hard because during the workshops we heard lots of ideas, and there wasn't any, silver bullet there. It was, should we limit, have a cap on the amount people can get? Should it, be a certain number, size of community, size of loan, things like that. So we looked at all those different scenarios, and, this is what we tried to come up with to look at. We're really looking at, it's a water quality program. We want to look at the biggest water quality benefit. We want to have a program that fits everybody's needs, but right now the need is too great. So we're having to limit it. But there are lots of considerations as far as, going into the bond market. We need to have some of the larger borrowers, those good secure loans for our portfolio. So, we need a little bit of everybody in the program, and it was really hard. And I think Christopher and his staff have done a great job coming up with something. We don't, like we say, we don't know how this will play out. We've done it as a test run through what we have in-house. We think it's going to work. We think we'll probably have to tweak it, but we're going to give it a run here. We think it'll give people more certainty, which is one of the biggest things people ask for right now. A lot of people are putting in a lot of effort, and then maybe not getting funding. Our staff are putting in a lot of effort working on projects that aren't getting funding. So I think overall it should help in the efficiency on both sides of the desk here. And so I just wanted to kind of close with that is that we did look at a lot of different scenarios, and we think we've come up with the best proposal, but we'll see, and we want to get your feedback. So.
All right. Well, if nobody has any questions, we're very happy to have you today and appreciate you coming. And like I say, comments are due noon, October 5th. And then, of course, you can come to the board meeting and make comments there as well.
You can talk
All
to
right.
us now, too.
And you can talk to us now. Absolutely. Absolutely.